Good afternoon. I'm here to claim I've been in contact with some or all of you in one way or another through emails and phone calls lately. Thank you all for coming. You have a great response. And you may have noticed yesterday, some of you would have received an email from research offices to say that we're at full capacity. But the Davenport kindly made another room available to us, so we've been able to accommodate extra people who would come in off the street. And thank you to the Davenport and to yourselves for coming. One important thing is that for yourselves, for GDPR reasons and so on, we're recording the event. Now you won't be on it unless you come up here and walk around and want to perform or do anything. The camera's facing this way, but just for you to know, the event is being recorded. I suppose I have your consent if anyone would like to leave. That's okay. The event will be posted to the website, but just for you to be aware of that, especially for when you ask questions later, and there'll be a Q&A question, so just for you to be aware that your sound, your voice will be recorded. The other thing is that we have a number of our funders available to speak to today, and you can't canvass them. As you know, with all of our calls, funders can't be canvassed in any way because the call goes through an assessment by international assessors, and any canvassing is actually a total waste of time for yourselves. You can just ask questions pertaining to how you apply, pertaining to the content of calls and so on. Some of you will be old hands at this, some of you may be new to it, and if any questions you do have, we'll do our very best to answer them today. There will be some that I may ask you to put in writing, and we'll get to that later anyway. Probably more detailed ones that might require specific question answers and more information that I would have to hand or in my memory right now today. So I have put Wi-Fi code up here, but it has disappeared again for some reason. So if you need it, it's Davenport Meeting, and that's capital D and capital M, Davenport Meeting 2018, and that's figures in 2018. And I'm Deirdre Quinn. All inquiries can go to projects@research.ie or to myself, Deirdre Quinn. If I happen to be on leave, the projects inbox will be answered more promptly, so you can CC both. Right, so I'll just kick off events. Or maybe we won't, because we will. That's where it went. Sorry. So there's the Wi-Fi code. Conference Davenport Meeting 2018, and it's conference Wi-Fi. Okay, so the structure of today, the breakdown is I'll talk about the context for the call, and that's quite important. We'll talk a little bit about the detail of the call and what it has emerged from. And for those of you who would have applied before, or you're from a research office, or you've heard on the grapevine that we previously had two funding strands called New Horizon and Research for Policy and Society, that this is a merger of those two strands, but it is different. So your application should reflect the difference in terms and conditions. We'll then look at the strand structure. After that, Mary McCarthy from Irish Aid, who's with us here on the right, will speak to you about the Irish Aid strand. The terms and conditions of that strand, which is strand 2B, are slightly different to the terms and conditions of all of strand 1 and strand 2A. So that's why Mary's going to give a little bit of a spiel about that strand. After that, then we'll have a Q&A with our funders. We have today Casey Treadwell-Shine from the Department of Children and Youth Affairs. We have Mary McCarthy from Irish Aid, Iris Elliott from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, Barra Casey from the Central Statistics Office, and Deirdre Lynn from the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. And I didn't actually get to meet Deirdre on the way in, so it's nice to see you in person. Thank you all for coming and making yourself available today. There will be a roving microphone going around during that session. I'd ask you, my colleague, either Ronan or Nahuel, will bring the microphone to you. I'd ask you, when you are asking the question, to identify the funder the funding partner it's for, or if it's just a general question, that's fine, but just to direct it to a certain person if relevant. And of course, if it's for the open call, feel free to ask questions at that point as well. After that, we'll look into the nitty-gritty of how to apply some of it. As I mentioned, some of the detail, I might have to get back to you about it, if you've very specific, tricky questions, which is inevitable, about cost or so on. I might have to get back to you. We'll take it on board and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And then at the end, we'll have an open floor where you can ask, within reason, whatever you like, okay? And we should be wrapping up around 3:30, if not beforehand. Sometimes these things run over as well, so it's just for you to know. Okay, so the Irish Research Council, many of you will have engaged with us previously, perhaps as a postgrad, already as a PI or as a research officer. Some of you may even have come through the entity that existed before the Irish Research Council, which was two entities, in fact, IRCSIT and IRCAS. They merged in 2012 to become the Irish Research Council, and consequently we fund across all disciplines. We fund solely on the basis of excellence, which is important for you to know when it comes to the assessment point. It's those with the applications that reach the highest level of points, basically, that are funded. Obviously it's all anonymous and so on, so it is that assessment for excellence is carried throughout the process. As part of the remit of the Council presented in 2012, part of that is to fund excellent research and to sustain a vibrant research community in Ireland. And that's where Research for Policy and Society and New Horizons, the two former strands, were very important in the previous years. But because Ireland has changed, because the research landscape has changed, where as a community we'd like to see it going, who deserves funding and so on, because that has changed, and because of the National Development Plan and the emergence of the Sustainable Development Goals identified by the UN, the two former calls have been merged and have become COALESCE. COALESCE is Collaborative Alliances for Societal Challenges, and societal challenges, some of those words will be familiar to you already through if you've been looking at Horizon 2020 and other funding type calls. But this is a unique call. It is the first challenge-based call in Ireland. We did have a previous call, which is now running very successfully. Caroline and Erkla, they're looking at challenges and sustainable development goals as a framework, and how, as researchers and a community, we respond to that. But this is the first iteration of a challenge-based call in Ireland that responds to the Sustainable Development Goals as well as the national strategic outcomes set up in the National Development Plan. So that's a bit of a mouthful. Those of you'll have heard of Ireland 2040. It's been in the news. You've seen the beautiful advertisements on the television that the government have spent a lot of money on. But this is, for us as a research community, this is what it means. That the Irish Research Council can set up connections between researchers, higher education institutes and civil partnerships to create research funding that will allow people to meet and address and explore sustainable development goals as well as national strategic outcomes as part of the Ireland 2040 plan. It's really important that you understand that your applications should, where relevant, speak to those entities, the national strategic outcomes and the sustainable development goals, because that is where research funding, a lot of it for the future, will be going. So if you think of Ireland 2040, that gives you a hint of where the government's vision for Ireland as a whole, for the Ireland we want to live in, and for us as researchers, where funding will be available and how we can work within that framework. So applications submitted to this call should reflect the terms and conditions, what was set up in Research for Policy and Society and New Horizons. It's still relevant to a degree, but it has changed, it has metamorphosized into this. So if as research offices you see similar applications coming in that you may have seen from a PI previously, you'd be doing them a great favour to gently indicate that this call is different and the same application They can submit it perhaps, but it may not, may be wasting their time to a point, that they need to address what's set out. The National Development Plan in Ireland 2040 is very relevant to all of Strand 1. It also, to a degree, will speak to Strand 2. Strand 2 addresses the strategic development goals identified by the UN. So that's the demarcation between Strand 1 and Strand 2. For your own benefit as well, you may like to look to Campus Engage, which is part of the Irish Universities Association. I'm not sure if Kate is there. So Kate, I don't know if you would like to speak a little bit about, if you want to later or now, about Campus Engage, about your role as joining HEIs and increasing the level of engagement between civil partnerships and HEIs. Would you like to now or later?
It's been impromptu, but
sorry.
No problem, but used to the drama. Basically, Campus Engage has been set up based at the Irish Universities Association, which is just a 5-minute walk from here, across the green, or the park there, Marion Square. And we are driven by the 7 universities, boards of 7 universities. We have 4 working groups, and one of those includes engaged research. So what we're trying to do is build the competencies and capacity of engaged researchers across the country and how they work with civil society organisations, government departments to plan for impact. So looking at the various ways product users, service users across human services are working with researchers to inform research. And I think this is perfectly aligned with what I've read the briefing piece here. And what we're doing at the moment, we have an active working group of 10 members from across your universities who are building a series of tools, so guidelines. We have a series of workshops in each of your institutions. Anyone from UCC here today? No? Oh, one UCC. So Anita, who's your Vice President for Research, is opening and driving the UCC Engaged Research Workshop next on the 14th. And that is all about building the how piece, the how to do engaged research. So that will be taking place on the various campuses, but also online with a series of how-to guides that look at that. We have built an engaged research framework, a planning for impact tool and guideline, and various documents on the practice and the principles of engaged research. But I'm Kate Morris at kate.morris@iua.ie. If you want to get in touch with me, I'd be more than happy to meet or chat or talk about how we can work with you on various projects.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Kate. I'm sure that will be a great advantage to people, not advantage, that's the wrong word, but very great support to people when they're applying to this. Because the end goal of COALESCE really is to try and match people who are producing and making knowledge with those who use knowledge, okay, and in between, so it's applicable. And it's applicable to our society and where research is going in this area for the future. So that's Campus Engage. You can be able to hook up there with Kate where necessary or appropriate. Just to Strand 1. Then Strand 1, I can't say it enough, make sure you become somewhat familiar with the Ireland 2040 plan, okay, and look at the national strategic outcomes. They speak directly to the framework for Strand 1. And Strand 1, and I've included here also our partner Irish Aid, who works at Strand 2. We'll talk about Strand 2 later, but on Strand 1, our partners are the CSO, Central Statistics Office, Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, Geological Survey Ireland, GSI. Now, Aoife Braden from GSI couldn't be with us today, but if you have specific questions relating to the GSI call later, you can bring them to me and we can address them in that way until appropriate. After that, they'd be submitted as FAQs, which we'll also talk about later. We've the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. Deirdre Lynn's from there, Sexual Health and Crisis Pregnancy Programme, along with the HSE. Maeve O'Brien could not be with us today, but the same applies in relation to questions. And the Department of Children and Youth Affairs. We have Casey Treadwell and Casey Treadwell Shine and Lorcan O'Brien with us today. And just on strand 1 as well, strand 1 is made up of sub-strands. There is an open call, and then there are strands which we'll look at who are funded by our partners listed here. If your particular project or your idea does not speak directly to the terms and conditions set out by one of our partner funders in one of these strands, make sure to look to the open call, which is strand 1A. And strand 1A is framed specifically by those national strategic outcomes. Familiarise yourself with those, and then you see if your project fits, if you can change it and adapt it into a viable application. Important deadlines for this call. The launch of the call is on the 1st of June, so release the terms and conditions. The expression of interest deadline is the 28th of June, which, if I am correct, is a Thursday. Please don't think it's a Friday. Many of our calls and deadlines are Fridays, but these will be mostly on Thursdays. So bear in mind that's a Thursday. The expression of interest deadline may open. Okay. I can talk you through it. I was just going to show you where it is on the website, but there's a COALESCE page under Principal-Led Investigators. The expression of interest deadline forms are currently under indicative documents. You can access them there. And there's one for strand 1, one for strand 2A, and one for strand 2B. Okay, you must, if you are going to submit an application in the online system, in order to be eligible, you must submit an expression of interest before the 28th of June this month, this year, okay? Otherwise, when you get to the online system, which opens on the 2nd of July, you will be unable to submit your application. So please bring this information to your institutes, your friends, your colleagues, your family, if anyone's applying, and so on. Tell everybody you know that this is an integral part of it. Now, you submit 2 parts of that. There is an abstract and a nomination reviewer template, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on. There's the FAQ deadline, which is the 20th of August. You can submit FAQs via your research office only, okay, via your research office only until the 20th of August, and they will be updated until the 28th of August, okay. After that, we're running into the deadline period and we will not be answering FAQs. Closing date of the 3rd of September. You must, at the outset, even when you are submitting your expression of interest, you must have informed your research office that you are going to do so. And then when your research office looks at your application in the beginning of September, it will not be brand new news to them. They will be familiar with it and they will be able to endorse it or not. If an application is not endorsed, it will not go through the next step, which is the eligibility checks. The eligibility checks are conducted by ourselves. When we're happy that your application is eligible, we move it to the next stage, which is the reviewer stage. The outcome of the scheme will be in December 2018, and the project start is before the end of December 2018. There has been some movement around that in the past, and I don't want to say it's extremely flexible, but we will address any issues relating to project starts at the end of December for successful applicants. Okay, so strand 1. The aim is to engage researchers and civil partnerships. So this collaboration is deeply important. It's deeply important also to cultivate that relationship in the long term. So projects that have long-term impact are projects that will really work on COALESCE. And successful applicants may also be thinking long-term in terms of their career, where they're going next, what they would be applying to next. So when you think of your application, try to think of not just obviously a locally based application, but an application that will deliver policy results. Okay, and when you say policy results, it will be evidence-based. The collaboration will allow you as a researcher to work with and influence partners and policy in the broader sense. Also, as part of the remit of strand 1 is to reward and incentivize so that people will grow and move into the research landscape as more developed and more experienced researchers. So this will be, if you're successful, it'll be a large fund. That's really important in terms of managing funding for going on to applications, larger applications. So from our perspective, we're really trying to help early career researchers grow. And the objectives, oh, here we go. You have to just be very vigorous with the laptop, it turns out. So strand one, as I mentioned, your application should be underpinned by movement towards one or more NSO. When you're submitting your expression of interest, you must indicate which NSO or how many and which ones they are, you will be referring to in your project. And the strategic funded partnerships are really important as well. On the expression of interest, indicate which funding partner and what type of, not on your expression of interest, but when you are working on your project application, look at collaboration. How is this going to increase your public and your international profile and your international network? You know, making connections with people and experts from abroad, so that you are becoming this early stage researcher perhaps or growing to be expert in your area in Ireland that will help further contribute to the research landscape. As I mentioned, it's evidence-based, so that you'll be able to influence decisions and set up the matching, not so much matching, but the working together with funders and will help engage real impact. You know, a lot of applications of all funding streams and every funder that has ever existed. So people will say, I will influence policy, but they don't actually have the connections to do that. So what we really want to see is that long-term impact growing out of this goal. And new opportunities, new PI, team in place. How are you going to develop that team? Who's coming up next in that team? We had a great story from the IT the other day from Research from Policy and Society applicants in Horizons. The person told us that their research assistant was so strong that they now have them, they're starting a PhD. That person hopefully eventually will be a postdoc and go back and be a PI. So it is a long-term vision. The content of the application is extremely important, but so too is the long-term vision being developed within it. And also then that speaks to developing teams. How is that going to add to the research network? And that's for us, that's part of why we are doing this as well. I won't go into these one by one, you can look them up. It would also take all day. And these are the 10 national strategic outcomes. Each of the funders, the funding partnerships in different ways reflect either explicitly or more subtly one or more of these national strategic outcomes. You'll find them as part of the National Planning Framework, which is part of the Innovate Ireland 2040 document. So there's a bit of heavy reading there, a bit of heavy lifting, but it will help to focus and identify the area for you, especially if you're applying to the open call. So there's compact growth, regional accessibility, strengthen rural economies and communities, sustainable mobility, a strong economy, high quality international connectivity, enhanced immunity and heritage, transition to low carbon and resilient society, sustainable management of water waste and environmental resources, and access to quality childcare, education and health services. So they really are the type of country, you know, if we could achieve all of these, it's the type of country you would really like to live in. So if you can see your research applying to that and contributing to it, the call for you. Sorry, this. Maybe it really just want to impress upon you how important the national strategic outcomes are. Sorry, it's very, I hope it doesn't blow up. Okay, there is the open call, 24 months, 120,000, okay? And then it's broken up into specific strands, 1B to 1E, and CSO, and Irish Humanities for Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, the two calls there, and CSO and IREC both are at 100,000 each for an 18-month call and a 15-month call. Please bear in mind that not all of these calls, these strands, are 24-month structures. They do have different structures. Bear that in mind when you're doing your planning for Gantt charts and project management. A HSE crisis pregnancy program is also 15 months at 100,000. And the Department of Children and Youth Affairs is 12 months at 90,000. And the Department of Culture, Heritage and Gaeltacht, and it's the National Parks and Wildlife Services, is 24 months at 100,000. Sorry. And then the two GSI calls are both at 24 months and broken up into 100,000 each. We have a budget, an overall budget. What happens for those of you who are already familiar, those deemed fundable will be funded until the pot runs dry, so to speak. But the good news is that if you are on a reserve list, this is not the end of the road. If you're on a reserve list, because this is a pilot program, we are currently and will continue to engage with public bodies and government departments who are interested in coming on board in the future. Some of them may have, and have indicated they may have funding available to perhaps co-fund or fund a project. If it happened, and this is all if it happened that you were on the reserve list and your project spoke to a particular department who happened to have funding, we would say this project is deemed fundable, but the pot has run dry. Are you interested in this? And if they say yes and you say yes, then you would be funded. And that might happen a little bit later than December, because obviously mechanisms of funding and so on have to turn for us to get to that point. But it's also important that if you want to be available to that and to be able to access that at the end of your funding application, you will be asked if we can make your application available anonymously to other funders. And if you tick yes, then we will have your consent to do that. And we're all very familiar with GDPR and so on. And that would be important just for you to tick that if you want to be considered for further funding. In terms of Strand 1 eligibility, this is quite important. You do not have to be a permanent PI to apply. What you do need to have is a contract of sufficient duration in order to carry out the proposed successful project from the research date, the start date, until the end. Your doctoral degree should be awarded no later than the 1st of November 2016, and you shouldn't be in receipt of any other funding from the Irish Research Council except New Foundations and or EUSA's award. So the main thing you should take home from that is that you don't have to be a permanent PI, you just have to have a fairly long-term contract to cover either a 12-month or 24-month project. Also, this is important. We may have people who apply to more than one strand, and we may have people who are successful on more than one strand, and that's okay. In fact, that's great news. It means that we've really strong PIs in the country. But if this is the case, you must be able to show at the point of being notified that you're successful, you must be able to show that you can devote the time to manage and foster the team, basically to grow this project to the end and complete all works. And that's quite important. And also that you can meet the terms and conditions set out by our funding partners. Also, not only can you apply to more than one strand and strand 1, but you can also apply to strand 1 and 2. And again, the same strategy applies in terms of managing time, being able to recruit, having time to do that, and to manage your team. Okay. The strand 1 evaluation will look familiar. It is like many of our other types of evaluation, with some added minor changes. There's 45 marks for the quality of the proposal. the policy, collaboration and impact is 25, and the feasibility of the implementation of the project is 20. And then obviously we want to see detailed budgets submitted, not one-liners, but please ensure you give full breakdown of your budget details. And the policy and collaboration will be really important to your application, showing where this is going, how you are going to impact policy, how the evidence that you are going to produce, the knowledge that you are going to produce is going to be used, and that it's not just pie in the sky, but that there is real conduit there for bringing that to fruition as a result of your collaboration with partners. It brings us to strand 2. For strand 2, our aim as a research funding agency is to support and expand, encourage collaboration, and to make sure that the ecosystem of the research landscape can be sustained. Now this is a pilot program, but we are hoping to gather lots of momentum, that it will be extremely successful, and that we will have lots of funding going forward, especially because we're addressing the first challenge-based call, and because we're addressing such important themes as the NSOs and the SDGs. So in the long term, what we're looking to do is support PIs who are growing, and we want to expand their capacity, and by doing so expand the capacity of the research landscape on a whole, to encourage and make possible collaboration, and to do that in a sustainable way. Sorry. Right. Let's do this all at once. Sorry. Okay, and what that means is that when you're applying, make sure your application speaks to the sustainable development goal. All right, it must underpin and frame and influence all of those words, your thinking process from now on to the end of your submission of your COALESCE application. Make sure that you show that you're building new connections, and that you're also, especially with a team, you're building connections for them. This doesn't have to be stated really explicitly, but your work in the project should speak to that. Ensure that you're setting up collaborations. Also that strand 2 speaks to the 2A. Strand 2A speaks to the STEAM agenda. Take a strong note of that, because you'll be working, if you're applying to strand 2A, it's PI, the lead PI must be from a humanities, social sciences background, arts, humanities and social sciences background, and then they work with a PI from a STEM background. So if you like, it's a major minor partnership with the AHSS PI being the lead, and not to be derogatory in any way, but the more minor contributor in this way would be the STEM PI. As a result of those connections, new opportunities should emerge in the long term and in the life of the project, and that it should also impact policy. I won't go into these too much, because I know Mary also is going to speak a bit more about them, but if you haven't come across the Sustainable Development Goals previously, we'll put them up on the website. They're in terms and conditions. There are also 17 of them, so I definitely won't go into them. But you should familiarise yourself with them and the caveats, what each one means for your research where appropriate. Okay, which brings us really to the eligibility for strand 2A. So this is the major minor partnership. You must also identify with one of the annexes, either Annex A or Annex B. And these are the list of disciplines. They're on the website. You'll be asked to identify that on the expression of interest, which one relates to you, and also in your application. And making sure that you pick the right the right category as part of that annex, because it helps us identify reviewers, it helps us identify international assessors, and without that, if you put it in the wrong category, we're sending it to the wrong people and you're not doing your application justice. So like strand 1, the PI should have a contract that allows you to carry out the project, be it 12 months or for the full duration of strand 2A. You work with a mandatory and named STEM co-PI. So this person will be identified, but the application really comes from the AHSS PI. For both, it applies that the PhD should be awarded no later than the 1st of November 2016, and like the other strands in Strand 1, you cannot be in receipt of any other funding other than new foundations and the Ulysses grant. Likewise, there's a breakdown of the quality of the proposals. Again, 45, that would be our traditional ballpark figure. Collaboration and impact, 25. Feasibility is 20, and proposed cost and value for money, 10. Again, can't impress upon you enough how important it is to look at feasibility, budgets, and how you're going to implement it, because these can be the difference between that one mark that gets someone funded and gets them over the line, or the difference between projects, and it's that attention to detail. Also, Strand 2A seeks to build on what would have happened with people applying to Research for Policy and Society in New Horizons previously, that PIs would look to apply to Horizon 2020 or other iterations of similar funding at that level. And this time we'll be looking towards FP9, so that will be evolving over the next number of years. It'll take over from Horizon 2020. So think about, how am I going to set myself up as a PI to be ready to apply to FP9, and that will be part of the long-term vision for applicants here. Okay, your eligibility for 2B is slightly different, okay, so bear that in mind if you're bringing it back to applicants or so on. Again, you have to be able to carry out the project from beginning to end, so you don't have to be permanent, but you do have to have an appropriate contract. With a mandatory and named co-PI employed by a research performing organisation in one of Irish Aid's partner countries, and who'll be in a position to carry out the proposed research from project start date until project end. So again, it has to be in one of Irish Aid's partner countries, and the contract has to be appropriate at the same level as well. Also, in terms of capacity and infrastructure, that must be in place. The PI must be able to carry out the research at the point of acceptance of the award, okay, and in the application, where possible, show that the infrastructure is in place. The lead applicant will be at least 5 years post PhD, so different to the other strands. Have 2 years experience as a PI, at least 2 years as a PI, have experience of collaboration with research consortia and or international research projects, have a track record in research under one or more Irish Aid themes for this strand. So Mary will talk to you a bit more about those themes and so on, and the underpinning framework and the Sustainable Development Goals. But please bear in mind that the eligibility for Strand 2B is different to the other strands. Okay, but again, it's 45, 25, 20, 10 breakdown. Okay, I'll leave you with that and perhaps invite Mary McCarthy from Irish Aid up to just talk to you for a few minutes, and then after that we'll have the Q&A. Okay, it's also getting quite warm in here, so it's all set up. You just might need to be a bit aggressive. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks, Deirdre. And it's just really, it's nice to have the opportunity to meet some of you. I've met some of you before, and just to go through briefly the kind of the background and context for Strand 2B, and really just to answer the question, why is Irish Aid sponsoring this particular strand, and what is the overall purpose of it? So as many of you in the room may know, Irish Aid has a research strategy. In front of me just here. You'll see up there as well, which is due to be reviewed at the end of this year. We've collaborated with the IRC before, primarily through the Andrew Green Scholarship, but now through a new Memorandum of Understanding, we're looking to scale up that collaboration through at least 2 new mechanisms this year, one of which is the COALESCE Fund. And as Deirdre has highlighted, this particular strand is in response to the kind of the global element of COALESCE, so responding to challenges set out as part of the SDGs, Agenda 2030. Research is central to Irish Aid's work in terms of poverty reduction, and just to kind of have a look as part of our strategy, the goal of research is that poverty and vulnerability are reduced through the application of research and evidence. So we have, as part of that strategy, a dual mandate to support research both here in Ireland and in our key partner countries. Many of you may have the question as to which partner countries are eligible under this call, and the focus is very much on the African continent, but Vietnam and Palestine are also eligible partner countries, so it's worth noting that at this stage. As part of the research strategy, there are three principal goals. The first one on to build evidence, new and existing, on Irish Aid priorities for poverty reduction. Now, whilst these priority thematic areas may shift somewhat over time, there are certain fundamentals that remain in place throughout. So, for example, Irish Aid is committed to working with the poorest and the most vulnerable, and that priority is not going to change. And that's very much a cornerstone of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is underpinned by the Leave No One Behind agenda. So having a target to focus on those who are the furthest behind and reaching the furthest behind first. So I suppose that means operating both in terms of poverty reduction, but also looking at inequality in those who may be the most marginalised or the most disadvantaged. And again, our focus very much on the African continent in terms of a regional focus of our work. The second objective is to strengthen communication and policy uptake of Irish Aid funded and other research. Again, this is something that Deirdre has mentioned, the idea that in the long term having a policy impact. And Irish Aid generates a significant body of research currently, but perhaps is not so good, which we would recognise, at then strategically implementing that and ensuring that it always informs our programming. And this is something we're really keen to improve upon. And thirdly, to look at improving capacity to plan for, conduct and apply development research in Irish Aid partner countries. And this is where the collaborative element of this call really comes to the fore. And the nature of Strand 2B is to be able to submit an application between at least two different research institutions, one in Ireland and one in one of our partner countries, and to collaborate in order to respond to a specific issue or challenge. We would recognise that these kinds of research collaborations are time and resource intensive, which is why you'll find that the time frame for this strand is probably longer. It's 3 years than many of the other strands under the call, and also with a slightly higher budget. It's important to note that there would be, within Irish Aid missions in partner countries, so in embassies, there would be specific initiatives to build institutional capacity of potential partners, but also under a previous programme of support that Irish Aid ran called the Programme for Strategic Cooperation, and some of you in this room would have been involved in that programme. There would have been institutional relationships built up between researchers in Ireland and researchers in partner countries. And it's our hope that those alliances and relationships can be reinvigorated and utilised for the purposes of this call as well as new institutional relationships. So I suppose our approach to research has been very much influenced by One World, One Future. So it's Irish Aid's current policy for international development. But to flag at this point that we are in the process of developing a new white paper for international development. So yes, this is a really useful framing, but there will be a new policy in place by the end of this year. And then also, I suppose, to reiterate the importance then of this as the principal framework for this call. I think most of you are familiar with the SDGs. So 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed at the end of 2015, signed up to by 193 countries, and really seeking to make progress on the dual fronts of both poverty and inequality. And in that respect, represent a real shift from the predecessor agenda, which was the Millennium Development Goals, which is very much about poverty reduction and ensuring that happened to developing countries or countries or poorer countries. Whereas under the Sustainable Development Goals, it's very much a universal agenda, and wealthier countries are as responsible, if not more responsible, for realising a vision of sustainability and equality. So I think the focus on justice and sustainability much more to the fore as part of the SDGs and Agenda 2030 than previously. So I suppose in summary, this would be the changing context within which this call is taking place. So we have the SDGs in place, most of you are familiar with them, and that provides a very broad scope for a huge range of different types of projects or applications. And I think particularly SDG 17, which is around partnership and collaboration for sustainable development, is very important to bear in mind. The new white paper for international development, there should be a draft paper in place in the autumn, and the process of developing this is already underway. There will also be a public consultation. But I think what you will certainly find within the white paper is that a reiterated commitment to the Leave No One Behind agenda, to working with the poorest and the most vulnerable. Looking at beyond the PSC, the Programme for Strategic Cooperation, which was previously in place, and kind of acknowledging the successes from that programme and trying to build on those, but also recognising that perhaps Irish Aid needs to be clearer in what it wants to achieve through its research agenda. The PSC was an extremely broad programme, and whilst thematically there's a great deal of breadth in this call, we feel that the parameters are possibly more refined and a bit clearer. We'd hope so. And the final item just to flag here is the idea of the fact that operating within conflict and fragility has become sort of the new normal in terms of anyone who is working in the arena of development. And whilst conflict and fragility is a standalone thematic heading under this call, whether you are submitting an application that is related to education or social protection or gender, that you are bearing in mind that backdrop of conflict and fragility, and that operating within protracted crises is something that we would need to see reflected in applications, or at least acknowledged. So as you can see, the thematic priorities are extremely broad, and that has been deliberate, I suppose, because it is a pilot strand to enable a breadth of applications to come in. But I also want to flag just here at the bottom right, one of the headings that we go from ag, food and nutrition all the way down to equality and inclusion, and you can choose one of those headings to frame your application, or you may choose to look at modalities, so means of delivery across a number of those headings, which is a nod really to a kind of an integrated programming approach. So I think there will be sufficient scope here from a number of different backgrounds or areas of expertise. And again, we didn't want to narrow it down too much at this stage, given that there has been a break between funding cycles from Irish Aid. So under one of these headings, but also linking it to the appropriate SDG or SDGs as part of your application. Okay, so it's very brief because I'm aware probably there'll be more in terms of questions, and it'd be more useful to give you time to ask me specific questions if needs be. But just to flag two other final things. Later in the year, I think Deirdre, you mentioned the new foundation strand. We would hope to be able to provide grants for networking and learning grants to create a pipeline of applications for future COALESCE calls. And secondly, for all applicants to this strand, I really wanted to just highlight the role of the Development Studies Association of Ireland. I know some of the working group, the study group leads are here, but the DSAI and its importance for anybody working in development, anyone from academia and research, just to either, if you're not a member of the DSAI, it would be important to join, and also potentially to reference the DSAI in your application form. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. At this point, there's a Q&A, so I'm just going to ask our funders to join us here at the top, in the round, and we can open the floor to questions. Sorry. Great, and just to remind you that you can identify yourself if you like, that's fine. But if you can specifically identify funder that the question is directed at, that'd be great. And as I said, if it's not, if it's a more general question, it's fine. And Ronan will bring the microphone to you. Right, put your hands up. And so actually, I probably never was going to mention this to you. If you'd like to, first of all, maybe give a couple of lines or a minute or two of where as funders are coming from, and what, as Mary did similarly, why this call, and not specifically what you're looking for, but what's driving it. So perhaps we start with Barra, if that would be okay.
Yeah. So my name is Barra Casey. I'm from the Central Statistics Office. So I suppose in CSO we haven't funded research like this before. We haven't been involved with the IRC before. But we're keen to see what kind of collaboration we can get from the research community. So I suppose the specific strand 1B that we're involved with here is 100 grand over 18 months, and it's specifically in relation to inflation, consumer inflation. So we'd be looking to maybe collaborate with economics departments in particular, and the inflation that we calculate, which is the consumer price index, is probably one of the most widely used pieces or statistics that we produce. So it's used specifically in indexation of social welfare payments, wages, taxation, thresholds, etc. So it affects everyone in the state, and it's really important that we calculate inflation correctly. So it's quite a big operation to produce an inflation rate every month. So we have and it's a monthly index. So I suppose one kind of problem that we've encountered is that we get totally caught up in the production of the statistics, and in terms of developing methodologies and the academic aspects of it, traditionally haven't been maybe addressed as they should be. So I suppose this research call really will kind of develop. Or as one aspect of what we're trying to do in the CSO, which is kind of ring fence development or research resources within the CSO, and then hopefully this then as well will add to that strategy, which is a more separating out production of statistics from the research and the methodology of the stats.
Great, thank you, Barra. Thank you. And next is Deirdre Lynn. Deirdre, if you wouldn't mind.
Hi, good afternoon. Yeah, my name is Deirdre Lynn, and I work for in the Science and Biodiversity Unit in the National Parks and Wildlife Service. We funded a biodiversity expenditure review back in 2015 through this process. We co-funded with the Irish Research Council, and UCD were successful in that bid. And this research call is building on that. And the rationale behind it is biodiversity is the living fabric on which we all depend, and we can see biodiversity underpinning and peppered throughout Sustainable Development Goals as well. It has its own dedicated Goal 15, and it also forms quite a large part of Goal 14 as well. And also from the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, we are encouraged to step up funding to conserve biodiversity. But the question arises, like, how much do we actually need? How much will we need in the future? Do we have enough money? Can we think of other creative ways of raising money? Should it just be exchequer funding? Should we be targeting business? Should we be looking at taxation, green bonds? So just kind of looking at other creative, innovative financial mechanisms to support the conservation of biodiversity. So also looking at removing perverse incentives, so to try and get the academic community to look at best practice in other countries, to see if other countries started to use any of these mechanisms, to make recommendations back to government, so we may be able to pursue different lines and think a bit more creatively than we have been doing traditionally.
Okay, thank you, Deirdre. And next is Casey Treadwell-Shine.
So our call is under 1E or 1F, sorry. Just to put a bit of context in it, as you probably know, the DCYA has a fairly big research agenda, and it's a very policy-heavy department. I've been brought in to develop an evidence into policy program, which is to meet policy priority needs in terms of research and evidence. So as part of the process, we've identified from the department policy priority need for an understanding of the pathways and risk and protective factors for at-risk youth getting involved in antisocial behaviour and in contact with the Gardaí. It hits a couple of kind of policy asks, both in terms of informing service provision on the ground, in terms of the development of the next National Youth Justice Strategy, and it also is very much looking to leverage the richness of the Growing Up in Ireland data. The Growing Up in Ireland, as people may know, is the national longitudinal study of children in Ireland. It's in its third wave now, so this particular cohort is now at 17 and 18 years that we're looking at in this study. What we haven't had to date is a really rich and deep longitudinal analysis of the data to actually establish causal pathways and establish causal risk and protective factors. So that's very much what the focus of this project is.
Great, thank you, Katie. And next is Iris Elliott.
Hi there, I'm Iris. I lead the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission's policy and research work. We've got 2 funding calls out in partnership with the Irish Research Council. One's on interculturalism and the other's on socioeconomic rights. They're both 15-month studies, 100,000 each. I suppose what's motivating us around that is to build the evidence base and the research community for human rights and equality in Ireland, and then also as part of that to make a contribution in terms of our European work and our global work around human rights and equality. I suppose from our point of view, what's really important is that there's a very strong focus on cross-disciplinary research and an innovative use of cross-disciplinary theoretical frameworks, methodological approaches, but also bringing that synergy between humanities and STEM to really significant human rights and equality challenges around interculturalism and socioeconomic rights. Also, what's really important for us is a really strong focus on substantial and authentic engagement with civil society organisations as well, because one of our statutory remits is around building cultures of human rights and equality in Ireland and reaching out up into Northern Ireland, so on the island of Ireland. So that, I would say, in terms of what we're looking for, those qualities are really important to us. And also, I suppose, because we're a relatively new organisation, we were established in 2014, we're really ambitious about growing a research community around human rights and equality. And in terms of earlier studies that we've funded, it was a strong focus for us in terms of any researcher that's successful in a funding call that we're involved with, is that they get a lot of really good experience around what does it mean to be an applied researcher in human rights and equality, how connect into policy and legislation, how does that engage with our strategic engagement team, for example. So there's a strong focus on offering all of those, I suppose, professional development opportunities for any researcher that's working alongside us. And I think therefore having a really good platform for academic research into different public policy research, change environments around human rights and equality. So we'd hope that would be very much a mutually beneficial experience in terms of coming into our community of researchers.
Thanks, Iris. And I think that would be, really important across all the calls, engaging together, that it would be a mutually benefiting experience, and so that people can grow out of it. And for us as well, if we can see that expanding in the long term, that would be really important. I think when you add to what you've heard, if you add the GSI calls and CPP calls, you can see that COALESCE is really a very broad funding stream, and we add in Irish Aid, and there should be, I would imagine, a lot of interest in your research organisations and from individuals as well. And we'd like to build on that, so from our perspective and from the perspective of the funders, we'd like to help grow that momentum when you leave here today. So if you have any questions, we'd really like to hear them as well. Specifically for the funders, that would be great, and anything else that we can either address now or address later. Gentleman here.
Okay. Yeah, there's a certain amount of talk about working sort of in collaboration with funders rather than it's simply a case of funders give the money and then researchers go and do whatever they do. Is there any expectation that there'll be any contact with the funders to discuss ideas prior to the application, or will it be once the applications are through, then you'll start talking about how the ways in which we'll collaborate together?
So in general,
Yes.
You may have already been in touch with a funder, up on, and that has happened. That happens. People do contact funders. We don't advise it should be done in a way that is deemed canvassing or looking for an advantage. Really, the project itself, the terms and conditions of each strand are quite explicit. And I think that an applicant should be able to intuitively and out of research experience be able to anticipate the type of collaboration that would work with this with these terms and conditions. So, and to avoid any fudging or smudging around areas of canvassing, it shouldn't be done. As I mentioned, canvassing isn't really worth it anyway. Because of the assessment structure, but any contact with the funders that explicitly identifies specific applications should be avoided. So I suppose in short, no. Thank you. Thanks. Anybody else? Usually when one person asks, we get a whole plethora of questions. Thank you. It's a lady here, Ronan.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask. I just wanted to ask with regards to Strand 1, could you say something about the co-funding from partners? It's mentioned in the evaluation criteria on page 66. Could you just elaborate on that? Because some researchers might have partners, but they might not necessarily get the funding from them for this.
Okay, so in terms of the strands themselves in Strand 1, the collaboration should show how the project, if you're, say, applying to Strand 1B, you should show how the application will set up collaborations, like what kind of workshops or what kind of projects will it be. I don't want to specify things, but will there be websites or repositories set up in conjunction with a partner? Is that the type of thing that will be part of the application? That should be explicitly shown what type of collaboration we'll work with. If it's one of our funders, that evidence should be given in the application. Okay, and in terms of partners outside, this is like more networks and connections for the open call. Does that answer your question?
It actually mentions co-funding from partners. That sounds almost as if they're supposed to provide a certain amount of funding, and this is under Strand 1.
There's a footnote under the table that actually says that that's not the requirement for Strands 1B through 1F because it is already funded by.
Oh yes, but does it apply to 1A? That you're bringing in partners, are they expected to?
I'm going to have to go back and look at that.
Yeah,
actually, sorry.
It's also mentioned earlier on as well, I think. It's on page 16. Sorry if you bear with me for 1 second. Yes, on page 16 it also mentions this could include co-funding from of proposed projects by intersectoral partners, and that's under 1A.
Under 1A, yeah. So there. I'm going to have to answer that in an email if that's okay, and I'll make the question answer available publicly.
Yes, that would be
Okay.
great.
Yeah.
And just to mention, it's also mentioned under Strand 2A evaluation criteria, co-funding from partners is mentioned.
Okay, I'm going to go back and look at that again.
Page 67 of that.
Right,
as well.
thanks.
Hi, sorry. There's a question about the special interest form. That is submitted by the applicant or by the research office?
By the applicant, but you'll be asked on it. Have you been in touch? The applicant will be asked, have they informed their research office? In which case, the correct answer and the truthful answer hopefully would be yes. And they can submit it to projects at research or if the research office wishes to submit it, that's fine too, and it should have the reviewer nominations along with it, and I'll talk about those in a second as well. Okay.
Just to follow up on that, is the expression of interest a screening stage or?
No, it has to be submitted as part of the assessment to be eligible, but it's not part of the screening stage. It's simply for us to identify reviewers really, and the nomination template that comes with it is to identify reviewers.
Were any of the, I suppose the Strand 1 projects, are collaborators allowed to go in as co-PIs, or is it under a single PI?
A single PI.
Okay, so if there's an existing collaboration, is there a mechanism, or it's just a single PI?
That the main lead PI would, do you mean in terms of submitting the application?
Yeah, or how it might be named on, so for example,
Okay,
for assessment,
yeah.
you assessed one based on one of the PI.
Yeah, the lead PI, and teams can be identified, but it would be, that lead PI who submits the application, it comes in under their ID. Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
Just a quick question in relation to Strand 2. Assuming that the partners need to be put in place before the expression of interest has been submitted, is it anticipated that there will be another call? I know it's a pilot program, but this time next year, just in terms of the amount of work that would need to be put into creating those types of transnational partnerships.
Well, just on the first part there, and I was going to move on to the EOI, but I won't say it again then, but we don't ask for the partner on just the NSO and the SDG. On 2B, we do ask an expression of interest if known at this point. The country, but we wouldn't envisage that you would have it in place, the partner in place by the end of June, and mainly because the expression of interest is for us to have an abstract to send to reviewers and to be able to find reviewers. And your second question was about, do you mean in relation to the council making?
Is it anticipated that the structure for the call will be similar next year, or would you be planning?
Hopefully with more funders. And similar, but obviously we will encounter, not obviously, but as happens when you pilot, you will encounter elements of the call that you would change. The structure is very much, and the application form also very similar to the New Horizons in terms of structure and research for policy and society. From that perspective, it will be similar. The application form will probably change next year, but the overall structure of the call probably will not migrate hugely from what it is now, unless there are major hiccups, or if we get feedback that indicates X or Y would have been extremely useful, and where possible we could take that on board and try to incorporate it.
And just from a funder perspective, then also, I would say certainly around 2B will be committed to signing an MOU with the Irish Leadership Council for 5 years initially. So there is that certainty. It's not a question of having this year and then not next year. So that 5-year commitment at the very least, and with the hopes of recognising the need to kind of keep funding as consistent as possible, particularly with these long-term transnational kind of research collaborations.
And similarly with all of our funders and funders who aren't on board with COALESCE at the moment, but who we also already work with, we would have MOUs set up of varying lengths of duration. So, and where possible, those links will be continued with others as well. So I don't want to commit anybody to any long-term marriage or anything just yet, but that would be the vision for it. Anybody else? Okay, I'll just move on to talking about the nitty-gritty of how to apply, unless you've any last questions. Thank your funders, thank you. And I know some of them have to travel now and so on, so I'll just give them a minute to back up. Sorry, I hope to be able to show you the expression of interest, but it just doesn't want to connect. So that's just to remind you, the EO deadline is the 28th of June. You're not asked on that to identify countries just yet, unless you know which country it may be. We do ask applicants to identify the strategic outcome and or the sustainable development goal, and that's just as important as other applications where you're asked for the keywords that underpin the project, key descriptors. So you're asked for up to 10 descriptors, and you can include those on the EOI form, which is available on the website, and then include a short abstract. The abstract should be, it may not be perfect just yet. It may change on the application itself, but it should not change hugely. You should not move from the core themes or the core NSOs. If it does, we would ask you to contact the research office and we will take it from there, okay? Because it's a pilot program, we'll look at things like that and we'll see what we can do. Along with the EOI, the expression of interest that is submitted to the email address projects@research.ie, you're asked to submit a template nominating 5 reviewers, 5 international reviewers in your field. They should be people who you, again, should not be canvassing against, pointless, but people you know of their work and you feel that they will understand your project and they will be able to give it a fair review. They understand where it's coming from, they understand the background reading, and they're an expert in your field. This is standard practice now across a number of our calls, so it may not be different to other applications you've submitted to us in the past couple of years, like on ERCLA, for instance. Along with the 5 nominated reviewers, if you can't think of 5, that's fine. If you can only think of 5, go with that. It's purely to help us identify reviewers and to bank them. And we appreciate that, it's summer while this is going to be running, so it's quite difficult to get reviewers at this time of the year, especially the international reviewers, because Europe shuts down for the month of August, so it really helps us. Also then, you must not, if you can identify 3 people, 3 reviewers you do not want to review your application, and this doesn't prejudice you in any way, it's absolutely fine, just we won't contact them. And contact details that should be included in that EOI should be professional details, publicly available only, okay, so they're affiliation details, alright, and we don't want phone numbers or so on, just an email address. And so just professional details that would be publicly available, that if we were to go and look up the field, we would find them anyway, and so on. So that's just a reminder, and that you cannot submit, you will not be able to go through the stage of submitting an application or even starting it without having submitted an EOI. The FAQ deadline, as I mentioned, is the 20th of August. They're sent anonymously via the research office. We will update them until the 28th of August after that. And you shouldn't, at no point should you phone individuals, phone the research office specifically with individual questions, okay? That's to protect yourselves, it's to protect us, and it's also to make sure there's a fair ground for everybody applying. All information, all questions come through the research office. Again, just there will be a little bit of flexibility around the start date, okay? but not much, but some. But just to bear that in mind, we would anticipate that projects will start at the end of December. That may not be possible given Christmas and so on, but we will look at that with successful applicants when the time comes. There we go. So this is what I can get to. So I've said this really, the updated until August 28th. FAQs, if you're not familiar with the process, please contact your research organisation. And now we've opened the floor. Because it won't connect, I can't show you the online system, but the online system is Smart Simple. You can find it via the Irish Research website, or even if you put in Smart Simple Irish Research Council, it will bring you to the login page. There will be a full user guide on the COALESCE website, that will take you step by step on how to apply. You will not be able to start an application until the 2nd of July anyway. And what happens initially is that you create a profile, and that will fill in your application, your applicant details, your institution. If you are already as an applicant registered on the site, what happens sometimes if people go and create a second application, a second profile, we get duplication obviously of profiles, causes problems. Again, technical issues come to your research office, they can send them to us. When it gets to the end of the call, if you have technical issues, be sure to put them in writing and contact us before deadlines, not after deadlines. We can't do anything after deadlines. Systems do fail sometimes, they're overloaded. We have a number of other calls running at the moment. And if that were to happen, and if the fault was on the side of the system, and we received your notification before the close of the call, we can help to a point. Sometimes we can't do anything. Sometimes we can help. Okay, so please bear that in mind. We can't do anything after it is closed. Most of you, I think a lot of you are familiar with Smart Simple already. Enterprise Ireland use it. I think SFI use a version of it. So is there any questions specifically around the application system? Yeah.
For the strand 2, if your partner is in Africa and they're the humanities partner, do they submit, or do you need the Irish partner to do the submission?
It will be under for all the calls, okay? And there'll be the applicant will be the lead, and they submit.
And so even if they're based in Africa, that's okay.
Pardon?
Even if they're based in Africa, that's okay.
I know. Well, the lead would be based in Ireland.
But you said that for stage 2, the lead was supposed to be the humanities partner.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the lead for all the stage 2s have to be the humanities partner in Ireland?
Yeah. Okay. And then the STEM PI, okay, would be, but the lead, it comes in under the first strand 2A, and with all the calls, the application comes in via the lead. And they would be based in Ireland. Any other questions?
How many projects do you anticipate funding under each strand?
Like one under each strand and the funders. Okay. So we're, with partners, there'll be one under each strand. Then was it 2 in Irish shape? Two
under 2B.
2B.
Yeah.
Then what happens is we have a certain amount of money that will be offered until it's completely used. So I can't give you an exact figure on how many projects will be offered. Thank you. How many projects will be offered? And as I mentioned as well, it is possible when someone's in reserve that we will have funders that will come on board. So I can't give you an exact figure now. It's at the moment, because it's a pilot, it'll be a movable feast. So I'm sorry for being vague.
Can you let us know the global total? That's well.
I can't because I'm under instruction that it's several million. As a whole, it's several million. So I'm sorry that that's vague, and there's some book work to be done.
Will there be sample application form for each strand of
Yeah,
second?
there'll be indicative documents up, if not by Friday, they'll be up on Monday. And if you are familiar, you can do one of two things. If you are familiar with Research for Policy in Society or New Horizons, it will reflect the structure, but the questions will be different. They'll address the questions that are relevant to this funding call. But if you're from a research officer, if you've applied before, it won't be like the postgrad or the ERCA application. It'll be more in line with the Research for Society, and then it'll be more streamlined next year. Just we're under very tight time frames this year, unfortunately, but that's just the nature of time sometimes. The indicative documents will be up. They will be there under the indicative document part of the website where the EOIs are. And if you've already applied, or if you're already on Smart Simple, if you applied to either of those two funding calls, you can have a look at previous iterations of those application forms, and they'll give you an idea. They'll basically be broken down into applicant details, identifying relevant strands and so on, and then it'll be broken up into abstract methodology and delivery with milestones in between. So it's a little bit more loose than the very systemized application forms for some of the other calls that are ongoing. Anything else? Yeah, sorry.
You stressed at the start that policy impact was hugely important, but you also stressed that partnership is very important. Can you when you're in the applications, should the impact outcomes or whatever be all explicitly linked to specific deliverables, like as in things that you will produce out of the thing, or can they be engagement activities?
Yeah, and it can be, and some of them, so there's kind of a balance to be struck here, because obviously PIs are largely in academia, they are in academia, so they have aims for, and pressures of publications and so on that they must meet. And then the collaborations and partnerships will also deliver different outcomes, and the overall deliverables should reflect that. It should not be like all publications, it should not be all engagement, it should be a good balance of both. And that makes sense to the application that's feasible, and that makes sense to the particular strand that's being applied to.
But so I wasn't really forgotten my application part, but things like policy related documents or do events, workshops or whatever.
Yeah, if it's we have to be, where workshops are in place, if something comes out of that workshop, okay, not just to have a workshop, but workshops that produce, the long-term impact, and we can see where change occurs. And this is general across all applications, I'd say, that we receive, and the way the attitude of international assessors to them. It's like, okay, here's a workshop, but what is it doing in the long term? So is there going to be a link up with a policy document as a result of this? Will it influence that? Will there be input? Is there a strong evidence that this workshop is creating new connections that will enable further work? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a policy document, but if it's enabling an action that there's evidence that it will have long-term impact, they're the kind of workshops, they're the kind of engagements that international assessors go, yeah, that's worth funding, that part of this project is worth a particular amount of points. So does that answer your question? Well, we get a lot of applications for workshops, and this will be across new foundations and other calls we have, and the workshop is great, but nothing happens afterwards. And this is actually to a point what COALESCE is also trying to address, that there will be a huge number of civic partners, civic society, civic groups, okay, and researchers, through no fault of their own, will come in and engage that group. but sometimes the research doesn't go anywhere, and that's because the connections haven't been enabled, and long-term impact engagement with policymakers hasn't been enabled. And so what we don't want to see is workshops or engagement with partnerships where the research is not used afterwards.
So I suppose that's my question. How concrete does could you in your proposal describe the planned future activity that would emerge from whatever?
Yeah.
But that there's no actual concrete, there's no thing out of it.
Yeah.
No object or document.
Yeah, there will be some of that. It will be abstract, that these connections will enable, say, a funding application later down to a specific stream that would also influence policy, or outcomes of this workshop will facilitate the hosting of a website that will host data or will host policy or learning activities that for educational purposes that might be relevant to a specific area, and so things like that. And I get what you're saying, that like you can say I'm set enabling international connections.
Yeah, but you don't have to actually, the website is not yet.
Hasn't come to being, or we don't really know if that international expert will always want to be friends with us, but we are hoping that it would build that connection that would help maybe young PIs grow, and they will be then in the position to look for support for a funding application for an ERC grant or something like that, to show that there's a vision there, and that the lifespan of the project is not just for the duration of the funding, but that it has long-term impact. Sorry.
No, that's perfect.
Okay. Yeah.
So in terms of outcomes, as well as policy documents, could that involve things like raising public awareness about issues, holding events to do that kind of awareness raising, creating a public conversation type activities?
Yeah, and if you can, again, I'm not going to tell you that this is what you should do, but when I look at what has been funded in the past, where that can be in some way measured and shown, that's useful. That's what international assessors go, okay, that's useful, we can see where it's going, and even if it's measured and you go, that didn't work. Now, they won't know it at the point of assessment. Not knowing how something works is really useful as well. In the long term, or to be able to change and adapt the kind of activities or the decimation of educational tools or whatever it is really important as well. But finding out what works and doesn't work. And I suppose because it's a pilot project, I have to be careful here. There is, this project, there's a certain amount of room. And we'll see what happens in pilot projects then is, approaches are often set and are challenged, and that can happen a lot, and hopefully that's what COALESCE would do. Traditional approaches might be challenged, and the partnerships will then facilitate that challenge and open up those new connections. So that can be good if it's new and refreshing, and acting on whatever the decimation is, or the kind of website you set up, or the policy engagement is. Yeah, sorry.
I think it's might be directed to Mary.
Yeah.
It's about the code PI. So, on this discussion, I'll go talk about it, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. The code PI needs to be applied by the research organisation in the partner country. You can up to 50% of the staff costs if they're not on a full-time contract or permanently employed. So the question is, do they have to be employed by the research organisation in the host country at the time of application or at the time the project started?
I might defer to Deirdre on this because I think it's the technicality. I suppose they need to be in place and have that contract in place for the duration of the research, for the life cycle of the project. So if that is forthcoming,
right.
I imagine then there's that's and you could indicate that. I'm
just envisioning a scenario where you might have a potential partner and the institution they're not actually working with the institution, but they would be if the project is funded, if it's successful.
But it's dependent on
funding.
Yeah.
And also, how do you demonstrate? I mean, how do you demonstrate that they are employed by
even
part of the country? Is that part of the
well, even with people who are employed here, there's a certain amount of trust that when we get to the point of award, we'll ask research officers and so on, is this person employed for 2 years or whatever it is? And sometimes they're not, and that causes big problems. So be wary of that. So there is a certain amount of trust. The person says, yes, I am employed, I have a 2-year contract. We take that on board, we check that then later, okay? So they're, if they're successful, then we would be certainly looking for full confirmation of employment status and the appropriate employment status in order to accept the award and to accept the funding.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is that people tell us, yes, I'm employed, and we take that on board, and then we check at the point of when we're about to, we go, you're successful, this is subject to the terms and conditions of the award. If you're successful, but then you cannot produce evidence that you are employed for the appropriate duration of the project, then I'm afraid we would have to retain the award until you do. And there would be a window of time at that point that you'd be given, and that could possibly be a very short window of time to prove that, and or otherwise it would be just offered to the next person on the list instead.
Okay.
So, and it's the same with, as I mentioned, it's the same with applicants to Ireland, but research offices vet, they will say they may be aware of the length of contract PI is on, and they may not endorse it. Okay.
But are we asking our institutions to endorse applications based on other institutions' employment?
Well, I suppose that,
It's just that I'm not sure how to actually sort of operate.
Yeah, and when we come to the research endorsement point, I think we'll put in, now that you brought it up, put in a clause there to address this issue specifically in relation to 2B.
It may not arise, it's just, I just thought of
yeah, no, it's perfectly viable. I suppose the terms and conditions also for 2B are like the infrastructure and the resources must be in place. Yeah. So there is that trust there that this person's saying he can carry it out. If the research office is very doubtful that this would never be in place, then I suppose it shouldn't be endorsed. Okay. Yeah. But I understand that, like, even in your own institution, it can be difficult to prove someone's employment, and people move too.
I had a related question just to that point.
Yeah.
So I understood from reading that as well that if somebody does have a contract in that the partner country, be it Vietnam or Palestine or somewhere in Africa, and that if they have a contract of employment that covers the duration, we can't include buyout costs for that individual in the budget.
And a certain amount of staff buyout costs. I can't remember the percentage breakdown now, but I will get it for you.
It might be possible to include buyout costs for that partner.
Yeah, a portion of it. Yeah, I can't remember. I don't want to give you the percentage now. I will look it up.
And we had to work that really. It was tricky because it covers so many different jurisdictions potentially where partner institutions might be. Yeah.